make as much as you can. Find something that you're curious about. Go after it. Find a problem. Design a solution to it.
How did you find the courage to go into that office and say, like, the thing that you hired me to do, you should actually just stop doing?
That moment was definitely one that stands out to me to this day as like a really pivotal moment. It became a launching into a lot more. The faster you can get to grips with that, you can either decide that you don't like it and you can figure out a way to not do that, or you can understand like, oh, it's a system. It's a system.
Hello, and welcome to The Pixelated Path. I'm your host, Chris Abad, and today we have a fantastic guest joining us. We're privileged to have Josh Brewer on the show. Josh is a designer, investor, and entrepreneur. He's currently a general partner at Enjoy the Work, where he helps founders become great CEOs. Throughout his impressive career, Josh has held pivotal roles such as principal designer at Twitter and director of user experience at Socialcast. He was also the co-founder and CEO of Abstract, a version-controlled workflow tool for design teams. In this episode, Josh shares his journey from his early days as a teacher to becoming a key player in the tech industry. We'll dive into the defining moments that shaped his career, the importance of collaborating between design and engineering, and how his early experiences influenced his approach to design and leadership. Josh also opens up about the challenges he faced and the pivotal decisions that led him to where he is today. One of the most fascinating parts of our conversation is when Josh talks about the moment he had to tell Twitter's CEO that a major project wasn't going to work, and how that honest conversation led to unexpected opportunities. You won't want to miss this. But before we dive in, I want to remind you to subscribe to The Pixelated Path on your favorite podcast platform. By subscribing, you'll never miss an episode filled with inspiring stories and valuable insights from top UX designers. Now, without further ado, let's welcome Josh to The Pixelated Path. All right. Welcome to The Pixelated Path, Josh. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Oh, thanks for having me
here. Yeah.
Oh, super stoked.
Cool. So today we're going to jump into talk a little bit about your career and kind of the winding path that's got you from where you started to where you're today.
No,
ready to jump in?
Awesome. Yeah, ready to go.
Okay. So let's see if we can go back to the beginning. Tell me a little bit about like what got you into UX in the first place. Like, how did you get started in the field?
Yeah. It's a great question. I would say that if I really trace this back, and this took a while. I mean, I don't know why it took me a while to piece this together, but I think one of the first times I ever had this like light bulb moment was the folks at The Great Discontent did an interview with me, and they were like, "But where did it really root from?" And out of college, I started teaching science and technology at a private elementary school in La Jolla, California. It was one of the first Apple Lighthouse schools. So it was the new iBooks had just come out, and all of the kids had computers, and so it was my job to help teach the teachers and help teach the students. And in the process of doing that, I realized a lot of that software was pretty rough, and it really made me curious about what's the difference between the good software that I enjoy using and a lot of the rest of the stuff. And that led me down the rabbit hole, which eventually led to starting to design and build websites and getting my hands dirty in that kind of universe. And honestly, it was that moment of just realizing that wow, some of the software is terrible and it's really hard to use, and it can be so much better. I always think of that as really the moment where it started. Fast forward a handful of years, and I started meeting some folks in San Diego in the startup scene, and RKAMP and web standards kind of movement going on at the time. That was when I made the transition into startups. And I mean, that's been my life ever since.
So you didn't, do you have any sort of formal training in this? So you started your career as a teacher.
I did. I will say growing up, definitely would say that I was artistic, did a lot of drawing and painting. In college, I was kind of minoring in art, but couldn't think of a way to make a living at the time. And so I thought of more as a hobby. Made some zines back in high school, that type of thing. But really, no, a lot of it was just absorbing things and practice. It was, here's a thing, how did they arrive at this? And so like reverse engineering how people design things, and man, reading a lot, especially about kind of the early 20th century graphic design movement and all of those things was like super foundational. Turns out I have an affinity for typography, so I got super nerdy very early in my career, which I think I'm very grateful for, because I felt like that was such a foundational piece of anything that you do, visual communication, hierarchy, all those pieces. So yeah, a lot of self-education.
Interesting. So a lot of your, like, that education that you're talking about that you did on your own was mostly in graphic design, not necessarily web design or
I would say it was, a mix of them. A lot of it was driven through web design, and then looking back at the foundations in graphic design and like understanding they're foundations. They're like principles, they're whole movements and styles and aesthetics and color theory and all those pieces. But like the way it manifested was in the thing that I was building, designing and building for the web. So it was applied, I guess is the best way to put it.
Interesting. So you went like really deep into the topics. I feel like there are so many UX designers today that maybe don't have like some of that type of background and education and training, because these were topics that were like very relevant part of core curriculum with like graphic design and print and stuff like that. But so there was a bit of a leap, because you went from, so you were a teacher, and then you had iBooks for your students.
Yep.
You realized that the design of those applications were poor.
Yeah.
And then and then fast forward, and then you're like really deep into the thick of like design education. Did you know that was a profession? Like, did you see the applications weren't well designed and you're like, I want to go do that? Or was that like something you stumbled on?
No, it took a little while. I mean, obviously somebody was doing that job, right? Like, and application design at the time, I don't think I would have quite put two and two together. Although like, I guess that's not entirely true, because I was also messing around with Director and Flash, and like that kind of multimedia universe. I mean, we were talking like 2000, 2001, 2002 era. And so I guess I understood that it was one. It just took me a little while. I started doing freelance stuff on the side. Turns out, as a teacher, that's useful, having some extra income. And in the process of doing that, I started falling in love with designing and building on the web. And so web standards, I mean, like many people our age, a huge shout out to Jeffrey Zeldman. And that was, for me, it was like this, like, oh, here's a really sane, structured way to think about building this stuff. And ironically, in high school, I wanted to be an architect, which I didn't end up doing. But I think that some of that energy showed up in the way that I think about products and building things. So, semantic structured HTML and CSS made a ton of sense. It just made sense to me. And I started falling in love with it, stay up late building things, basically reverse engineering someone's code, and how they had done it was like, that was evenings and weekends and stuff. And so eventually I finally realized, oh, I'm making money on the side doing this. Like this could be a profession. And the real story is that one night right before falling asleep, my wife and I are talking, and I'm definitely being a little bit whiny, and poor me, like, oh, I'm never going to make any money being a teacher and blah, blah, blah. She's like, I mean, if that's your mindset, then you're right. And she just rolled over and went to sleep. And I was left there just stunned with the honesty of her statement. And I was like, right, turns out I'm in charge of my life. Can I do something about this? And so I literally the next day went and applied for a handful of positions, and ended up interviewing at a couple places, realized I didn't want to work at those places, but it Like one of them involved a 45-minute coding test, which was like, it was fantastic because it was like, hell yeah, I can definitely do this. And like, I felt great about my results. They were super hyped. I just didn't really feel like it was the right fit at the time. So, but like all of a sudden, it was this moment where I was like, oh, here's a thing that I like doing. I'm pretty good at it, and people will pay me. I should do this. Like it was just this, and then it was like deep dive. And so, there was a few years of like really just doing it on the side before it became the thing that I did.
So you found a few places that you realized weren't for you.
Yeah.
Where was the first place that stuck? Where did you land first where you actually got paid to do this other than the freelancing work that you're doing?
Yeah. To be honest, the freelancing stuff was great. A lot of it was like small websites, and occasionally it was like one of the first clients that I had that I did a lot of work with was doing a web hosting service. And that was like great experience around actually building an app and not just a website. But the first company that I went all in on was a real estate training company. And the reason that I jumped in is they had hired this great engineer who was writing everything in Ruby on Rails. And they really wanted to build a online community aspect to what they were doing in real life. And it was like this interesting intersection of like, I like the technology, I like the engineer. The community piece of it was something that really appealed to me. Fast forward, I realized like this is at the root of like almost everything I've done in my career. Something around communication, collaboration, connecting people is definitely a big part of it. And so they allowed me to work remotely, which was, this is 2005 or 6. And I was like, I can work from home and do this. I'm stoked. And so that was where it kind of like really kicked off. And that's where the startup bug got developed pretty seriously.
Nice. Do you feel like at this place, that's sort of what set you on the direction of focusing on like communication and connection? Or do you think that was more kind of inherent in what you liked, and so you naturally landed there and other places that did that?
Yeah, I do not think it was like clear intention, like this is my purpose and I'm going to go choose things. It was more just me being me. Only in hindsight can I look back and understand that that's like a common thread throughout everything. But at the time, it was a great opportunity. They paid me well. I got to work from home. And like I said, I really liked the engineer that I was working with. And between the two of us, we built out this whole product. I mean, from that moment forward, it was like, okay, this is amazing. And I'll say this much: had I worked with an engineer who was not as good and not as great of a collaborator, I don't know, maybe my experience would have been very different and it would have veered in a completely different direction. But I've been unbelievably fortunate to work with some incredibly talented engineers throughout my whole career. And that partnership between design and engineering, always talk about it as two sides of the same coin. You can't talk about UX without acknowledging that engineering is deeply part of UX, and the decisions that we make on that side affect the experience that the user's having. And so I look back at that as well as like this moment that like made it clear to me that when design and engineering are like clicking, when there's connection, when there's clear communication and a shared goal, man, you can move mountains, and you can build really, really incredible experiences. So I'm so grateful, honestly. When I look back, like I'm really grateful that happened at that moment.
That's really interesting. I agree. I think you're fortunate that you had that experience very early in your career, because I think a lot of people will say that that's not always the norm. There's a lot of people who have whatever function, engineering, product management, marketing, like whatever cross-functional partner, and they don't work well together. And they go through a few of those before they find someone they work really well with, and then they realize what it could look like. But you sort of like had that experience from the very beginning, and that kept you hooked into design, it sounds like.
Well, it kept me hooked into design, and I think it made me a good collaborator with engineering. So the ability to build connection and like, honestly, it's like great engineers want to build great products. Like they really do. They want it to look good. They want it to be performant. They want people to be like, damn, just as much as we do. And so I think what it really set me up for was understanding that I'm not the only one. Design is not the like top of the mountain. There's no, although the old ivory tower analogy has been used for so long, because I think a lot of times people didn't understand how design did what it did, or even why it was important, but they kind of knew when it wasn't there. And there's all this weird mystery. And then if you reflect back on like advertising as a expression of design in the generation before us, the grand reveal, right? Like you never show anything until all the way at the end. There's all this mystery. Like we have some magic, which I don't know. There's a little magic to what we do, but not in the way that like I think most people think about it. And so if you are behaving in that like separate, isolated, ivory tower-ish way, then it makes it harder to connect with the other people that you're working with and building together. So I think that was a real advantage that I had early on, is just understanding that like I'm one piece of this puzzle. I have a responsibility to the customer and to the business and to my partners that are trying to, solve these problems. And I think when you approach work that way, it's a lot easier to like not hate what you're doing. In our family, we use the phrase "words are hard" a lot, because it turns out sometimes they are. We can say the same word, but they mean two different things based on the life experience, but also like sometimes it's just the experience that we're having. And so understand, again, it's funny when I don't know, I appreciate you asking these questions, because I'm connecting a bunch of dots, right? Like if you think about user experience as like a conversation between a product and the person using that product, it all holds, right? Like it's about this exchange between two people or a person and a service, and fundamentally how we meet one another there, and the words we use and the way that we connect, guide. There's a lot of overlap there.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to go back to, because you were mentioning like this idea of ivory tower design before. And I was thinking back, because I know there was a time when like this concept of ivory tower design was everywhere. Everyone talked about it, and so many businesses and cross-functional partners were afraid of it. It was like the number one reason why they were skeptical of design. And I feel like to some extent that's faded away, or I mean, maybe that's just me and I've been fortunate, but do you think maybe we've just like evolved in our like industry and our practice, and that's why that's no longer the thing?
Yeah, I don't know, I think is my honest answer. I would like to think yes. A lot of the last decade in my mind was about design really kind of like growing up. I joked for a while that like in the teens, we were in our awkward teenager phase, which felt really accurate. Suddenly had power and responsibility, and we're like, oh, what? And I think in some cases, as an industry, we've done a lot to move things forward, to advocate for ourselves, to find ways to work more effectively cross-functionally. I'll be totally honest with you. I've seen a lot of companies talk about valuing design, and then when push comes to shove, it doesn't materialize. And so that's why my answer is like, I'm not sure. I do believe that we have moved past the ivory tower. Like I think that that's true. And I still feel like there's kind of like a level of maturity as an industry that I had hoped we would have hit by now. And I feel like we're still working our way through it.
And I think some of that is like we sort of project that maybe we're further ahead than we are. Like you said, some companies talk about valuing design, but in practice, you don't see it. Do you have a particular example that you'd be willing to share? Especially from your investment days, I imagine you have like maybe a portfolio company that you sort of got involved with them because they said design was important, and as things played out, maybe that wasn't the case.
No, I appreciate the line of inquiry. I feel really lucky that I don't have any immediate horror stories. I feel like what I can say is during the time while we were building and running Abstract, there were a lot of teams that were like, God, please help us. We're we're trying to establish like healthy practices. Like we're trying to just basically like level up how design is done in our organization, and our leaders are buying into it. They're giving us room to run on this. And a lot of times what ended up playing out was they believed, based on what was going on in the broader ecosystem, that like, oh, the Facebooks and the Airbnbs and the Twitters of the world, like they invested in design and look at them. And so it's this like surface level understanding of what it means versus like, what does it mean to have design be part of the way that you think and the way that you operate and the way that your business even goes about doing what it does. You can tell I don't have a company that I'm going to throw under the bus at this point. And you could probably pick any large public company and they will say that they value design. And then the folks that I talk to who are on the line every day with unrealistic demands on top of them, on one hand, be very user-centric, do research, make sure that these things are validated, de-risk all the changes that we're about to make. And oh, by the way, we need 5 new things by the end of the quarter. It's like they're really at odds with each other. And some of that comes from a lack of understanding how like product design and engineering need to iterate their way towards things. I think a lot of it is legacy systems around a waterfall. I don't remember who said this, but someone talked about agile waterfalls. And I was like, that's fantastic. So it's like, we're agile, but we waterfall, meaning that like it's still getting thrown over the wall. We're still not being honest about timelines and estimation and commitments. And the companies that I think are doing it well are ones where design, product engineering, probably even like sales and marketing to a degree, have a healthy communication going on around the goals, the targets, the timelines, and like the outcomes that everyone are looking to achieve. And then they're working backwards from that to figure out how to go do that versus the ones that are like, we're doing this by this. Like, and look, I've been guilty absolutely in my career of like, we're doing this by this date, just has to happen. I don't know if you can ever get completely away from that, but when those are exceptions versus when that's just the default way of operating, that to me is the dichotomy. And I think what can make for a unpleasant experience versus a healthier, more functional experience in the company.
Interesting. You did mention your time in abstract, and I want to put a pin in that because I want to make sure that I come back to that. But before we get there, I think it would be definitely a missed opportunity if we didn't talk about your time at Twitter. Tell me about an experience that you had at Twitter that you feel like sort of shaped your career going forward. And I imagine there were a few, but if you have a favorite.
Yeah, there's definitely a few like really big ones that stand out. The earliest one was, God, I guess it must have been either very late 2010 or like January 2011. And I had come in 2010. Originally, I was going to work on the events product. And everyone who's watching this is saying to themselves, what events product? And that's because it never shipped. Lots of reasons. Bottom line, amazing team. I'm still in connection and communication with a lot of the folks on that team to this day. They are just such good humans. So again, super lucky, great relationships around the table. And we were building some stuff and we tried it out with the Oscars and we realized we might be able to get partway there by doing human curation mixed in with algorithmic stuff. And then we realized there just weren't the APIs and endpoints on the search side of things that we needed to actually deliver it. And that team was like, hey, it's going to take us time to build, like, thank you for designing an experience and showing what we need to build in order to make something like that real. It's going to be 2 quarters, before anything like that is even possible. And so myself and the PM on the project, Isaac Hepworth, had to go into Dick's office and basically be like, hey, so like, you should probably shut this project down. And here's all the reasons why. And we need this and this and this from the search infrastructure. And they're working on it, but it's going to be a while. And I kid you not, I really thought I was going to lose my job. Like, I really thought this isn't working. And so now I'm going to be redundant at that point, which in retrospect, that was very silly. There was so much to do. We were understaffed. So I don't know why that went through my brain, but I was worried. And instead, both Isaac and I ended up getting put on bigger projects. And it really allowed me to step into a role in helping lead some larger projects and manage some of the folks on the team. And I mean, that continued forward, but that moment was definitely one that stands out to me to this day as like a really pivotal moment that might not have been that big of a deal to anybody else, but to me, I really thought that was like the end, and instead it became a launching into a lot more.
How did you find the courage to go into that office and say, like, the thing that you hired me to do, you should actually just stop doing? It's not going to.
Yeah. So my memory's a little fuzzy on this because it's been long enough at this point. I remember a couple conversations with folks on the team. Chloe, who ran the media team, was driving a lot of this, and then Isaac, who was the PM leading it. And I remember one conversation with Isaac in particular where it was really like, are we aligned here? Are we in agreement that this is like, what is the recommendation we would make? Right. And trying to like put ourselves in Dick's shoes of like, he needs to make budget decisions. He needs to like staff up in certain areas. He also needs to know that like, we can't do some of the things, like we don't have functionality that like a lot of ideas that people had at that time really were dependent on. And so on one hand, it was like this moment of like, if I'm doing right by the company, then like, that's the right thing to do. And, you know, I think we both figured worst case scenario, we lose our jobs. Best case scenario, we get reassigned to something else. And I think it was just being really radically honest about because I knew what was being asked of us. And I knew if we didn't get really honest about where we were, then it would be maybe another quarter and everyone would be like song and dancing, and then we'd be really screwed. And in my experience, it is especially when it comes to building software, it's so much better to be honest early, right? Like if you made commitments and then you're like, new information, and this new information has radically changed the timeline or the scope or whatnot, the sooner you can do that, the better, because then everyone's armed with new information and you can make quicker, smaller adjustments. And sometimes they're bigger adjustments, but like, it's just always been, in my experience, worse to put that stuff off.
And so you mentioned a few things, really, like a whole bunch of really awesome takeaways that I think could be helpful for other people as they're navigating a career. But for you, you know, you confronted the scary moment, you went in, you sort of shared the honest truth about what was going on. But in the end, it wasn't even neutral. I mean, this probably ended up becoming like a positive step function change for you in your career.
Yeah.
Was there a lesson for you that you took away in terms of like how you will grow your career in the future?
I appreciate the question. I think I don't know about now and how I would apply that. I think it's maybe been applied like in the last decade. One of those was, if you're in a position of responsibility for something, own it. Like really go in. And a lot of times it's not just you. So like there's partnerships going on. And so again, I'm going to come back to this thing of like, can I be honest with the people I'm working with? Can we find a way to create enough safety to be really real with each other about what's going on and the reality of whether we can or can't do a thing? And if we can't do it, what can we do, right? Like, so sometimes it's honestly, so much is negotiation, like all the time. All the conversations we're having, they're just these micro negotiations. And like, when you can operate out of a place of commitment or agreement with one another, like I look back at Isaac is a great PM and he was such a great partner because I felt like I could actually trust him. He was showing up in the same way. I didn't feel like he had some ulterior agenda, you know, and I've experienced plenty of that in other places and other times. But the lesson was the trust, the responsibility. When you operate out of those places, doors open. Even in worst case scenarios, when you're operating operating out of integrity is maybe a good way to put that, right? And I'm not saying like, you know, bear everything all the time and whatnot. Like that's not what I'm saying. But I believe you can operate with integrity in your own self and then in your interactions with your folks that you're working with. And that extends up too. If you're reporting, if the CEO, how you show up in those relationships, it matters. And that has been true my whole career. That's my whole life. Like if I look back on that one, that is really, really true. And if you can Like, look, if I made a commitment to you that I was going to have a thing done by a certain point in time, and then I missed it and didn't say anything to you about it, versus as soon as I realized I was not going to make that, I reached out and said, hey, here's what's going on. Here's what's different. What do we want to do? Like, the trust that gets built in that moment is massive, and those compound over time. And so I look at that as like, not only are you building trust with the people you report to, but you're building trust with your peers. And whether you're in an actual leadership position or not, you can lead in your actions. You can lead in how you show up, and other people will either meet that energy or they won't. And you will know very quickly if people aren't meeting you with that same energy. That's like, hey, that's good information, you know? So that one has been really valuable throughout my whole career.
Nice. I think your insights on leadership are super powerful and important. I have to believe that approach and these ideas that you have about leadership and how important it is was critical for your success during your time at Abstract. But before we jump into Abstract, maybe for listeners that aren't familiar, could you share a little bit of like what Abstract was and sort of the backstory of Abstract?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for that question. And actually, it's a great segue because really the genesis of Abstract started at Twitter. Design team was growing rapidly. We were trying to figure out how to like work on things in a systematic way. One of my colleagues at the time was Andrei Harasimchuk, who had been at Yahoo and led a huge redesign there. And he and I were talking about like, and also very important for people listening to this, we were using Photoshop at the time, which meant one file per screen. Okay, so Sketch didn't exist yet. Fireworks was dying, unfortunately. And so not only could only one person work on a file at a time, only one person could work on a screen at a time. And so like, it was like, what are we going to do? And one of the big epiphanies was this idea of shifting from my files to our files. That was like a radical moment inside of Twitter's design team where it was like, okay, we're going to use a centralized version control system. We used Subversion because it could handle binary files. And basically, if you were working on something, you checked that out and then you would check it back in. And we had to have this systematic way of working so that multiple people could work on stuff together. We were in the process of a huge redesign, and this enabled us to move, honestly, probably like twice as fast as we could have in the way that we had been working previously. Eventually, we built this little internal tool that was like an internal, like intranet hosted version of WordPress that connected directly to that Subversion repo. And so basically, designers would start creating these posts that looked a lot like a commit message. If you squint at it, like, what is the problem? What are the constraints? What metrics are we trying to move? Here's the first set of explorations. And then it would get published internally. And I remember when we turned that on, people were like, this is what you guys do? You guys do way more work than we thought you did. Like, it was such an illuminating moment. And so huge insight for me was, if we can basically allow other people to observe the process of how we do our work, everyone benefits. Same thing for if you go back to GitHub and engineering. Suddenly, the pull requests and the commit messages, they're this artifact that's observable. Like, what went on? How did this get explored? What worked? What didn't work? How did we arrive at this place? And oh, by the way, if we need to, we can roll back and we can fix a thing. When I decided to leave Twitter, I actually left to start an incubator. And I thought, I didn't even think about building Abstract at the time, because I was like, number one, binary files, you can't understand what changed inside of them. So to me, the idea was dead. Fast forward at Habitat, which was the incubator I ran, Kevin Smith, my co-founder at Abstract, came to me one day and was like, why don't designers have a way to work like engineers do? Like, why isn't there like a structured way of work? And I was like, oh, dude, get my soapbox out, give him the spiel for a while. And he just reflected back to me, you're telling me that it's because of binary files. And I was like, totally. Like, if we could understand and like structurally reason about what's changed inside of a binary file. I know exactly what this, kind of should be. Kevin, being the incredible person he is, went away and like 2 weeks later came back with a working prototype on a sketch file where he basically branched it, did changes, merged those two files back together. And I just was like, so do you want to start a company? Like, we should spin this out. We should raise money for this. Like, holy shit, let's go. That's the hyper condensed version of it. But like, that really was the thing. It was like, how can we enable teams to work effectively and efficiently in an open way for years? And I mean, we knew this in 2015, but this was still true years later. There were literally teams where they had checkout times. So one designer would work on a sketch file from 9 until noon. Another designer would work on it from noon until 3. And then the third designer would work on it from 3 until 6. Because Dropbox and conflicted copies, and anyone who was there knows exactly what I'm talking about.
Wow.
Anyone who has only ever used Figma, if you're watching this, we probably sound like, war story, if you were there. But if you were there, you know what I'm talking about and how frustrating it was. You didn't have multiple people in one file at one time. You couldn't do versioning well. It was not a structured, sane way of working. And so our belief was, if we could make the design process observable to the rest of the business, that means everybody understands where we're at. They understand why we're making the decisions we're making. Sales has a glimpse into where we're going. Engineering is tracking along and checking us and saying, hey, we don't have APIs for that, right? Catching it days, weeks, months before, when they would normally be like, thanks for spending a quarter designing this. We can't build half of it, right? And so like, the whole goal was just to collapse that down and to get us working in a similar fashion to our engineering counterparts. So anyways, I could talk about it forever, but that was the genesis of what we were doing there.
It's interesting. I feel like we've almost come full circle, because so much of Abstract was about empowering better, stronger connections between designers and engineers. Yep. Going back to the beginning of your career, where you saw how powerful it is when designers and engineers are actually partnering together. That's awesome.
Yeah. Appreciate that. No, that's core. It is. That was like the foundational piece of it. And even, Evan and I, that was and the rest of the team, the folks designing and building the thing. It was that dance and that communication.
So we went from, like, we were talking about your time at Twitter, and now we're talking about this like light bulb moment you had, and you went and did a startup. And then in the middle there, you had an incubator. I think there's an important career transition where you went from basically working for someone else to working for yourself, which I think a lot of people aspire to do. Sometimes either don't know how to make that leap, or maybe just a little too afraid to make that leap. What was that like for you? Yeah. Was there like a trigger moment, or like why did you leave Twitter?
Yeah, no, there's several answers to that question. One of them was that mid 2013, I could literally talk for quite a while about this, so I'm gonna collapse this down. One event was I gave a talk in Düsseldorf at Beyond Tellerrand in 2013. And the keynote speaker the first day was a guy named James Victori. And he had this whole narrative about being a victim and stuff that was in there. And I felt like he was just talking to me. Like there was no one else in the room. And it was basically like, all of your excuses and all your reasons not to take this leap are just excuses. Like, get over it and do it. Do the thing. You will regret not taking the leap, was kind of the energy there. And that shook me. Like, it really, really shook me. I also happened to have this idea at the time. I had a number of designers and engineers that were reaching out constantly being like, hey, I've got this idea. How do I find a co-founder? Or I've got an idea and a co-founder. I don't know how to raise the capital. Or I've got this thing, but I need some time and space to work on it. And I started thinking, okay, when you've got more senior folks who like understand what they're doing, and they have this idea, but they don't have one of these pieces. And like I just said, it's like one of a few different pieces. could you create an environment where like there's some pressure, right? Like there's just enough pressure so people aren't just like floating around, but it's designed explicitly to bring design and engineering together, identify problems to be solved, and then go about it in a like very iterative approach. And so like basically any of the ideas we worked on got more investment if we hit a certain milestone. Like if it was like, hey, we need to do this in order to validate a concept. Great, do it. Did we validate it? Oh, it turns out no, we didn't. We validated that this is terrible. We should stop. Or you'd get there and you'd be like, oh, we got some intent here. We should build the next thing. So it was always this like incremental, iterative process. And we built some really cool stuff there, spun a couple companies out of there. And for me, that leap, and also it wasn't actually as smooth as I wanted it to be. I left and thought it was going to look a certain way. Then, I don't know, 3-4 months later, it was pretty clear that was not going to be the way that it worked. And I kind of put it on the shelf for like 6 months and was like, kind of, what am I going to do? Oh my God, I left Twitter. Like there definitely was a like wandering in the wilderness kind of period. And then one of the first people I ever pitched the idea to, I caught up with him and he was like, why aren't you doing this? And I was like, blah, 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 reason, excuse. And he's like, so like, what would you need to do it today? Which I thought was like the greatest question he could have asked. It's like, what would need to be true today for you to go do this? And I was like, well, I need about this much capital. And my expectation is in this period of time, we can prove this, this, and this. And he's like, cool, I will write the check. What? And so again, relationships, people who you have connection and rapport with, that you've built trust. And this person is still a dear friend to me all these years later. I mean, it really was that moment where someone said yes. I said, this is what I need. And they said yes.
Wow.
And I go back. One of the things I teach my kids is like, look, the worst someone can say is no. The worst they could say is no. If you don't ask for it, you're definitely not going to get it. And if you're afraid of no, then you're going to be paralyzed and you're not going to ask. And so, real talk, my kids say this to us all the time. They're like, you might say no, but you always say the worst you could say is no, and I'm like, hell yes. And so I think it was building that muscle, developing that self-confidence. And let me be super real. It's terrifying. It's like real. And then when you take capital, when you start employing other people, I don't know, everybody has a different experience with this, but I felt very responsible. And so like, as things went on and as we did more, that continued to mount. I wouldn't trade any of it. Like even the hardest, worst moments, I've still learned so much from. And I think the last thing I'll say on that is like, there are very few things that you can't undo. Like my wife and I had a lot of conversations where she's like, are you sure? And I'm like, no, I'm not. And I can get a job tomorrow. Like I was fortunate enough at the time in my career that I knew that I could get a job. Like I could go back to a startup and design stuff. So there was some level of safety net, you know what I mean? Like, wasn't guaranteed, but it was like high probability. And so it was like knowing that, she and I made the decision to be like, okay, like the worst that could happen is that this doesn't work and you got to go get a job. All right. And that was like year over year like through the whole abstract journey, it was like, so what does next year look like? And we're like, I don't know. We need to hit this milestone and then we do this. And she's like, okay. And so like, God bless her. She went along for the ride and we constantly had that conversation of like, okay, and if this doesn't work, what do we do? So maybe that's my extremely long-winded way of saying like, it's worth taking the risks. And like the odds are you can undo a lot of things. I'd rather have taken a step forward on my path, hit a dead end and had to back up and go right than like always wonder what would have happened if I would have kept going. Like that used to like keep me up. It just the like, I don't want to be old and regret not having taken that risk. And like, to be fair, there's some risks that are a lot riskier than others. And so everyone watching this, please hear me when I say, like, do your homework and understand what some of those are. But even then, man, life is amazing and it's long. And there are opportunities to zig and zag. And, if this way isn't it, okay, come back over here. And maybe over time you'll find where your kind of equilibrium is and a path that feels right. So I think take that leap.
You mentioned sort of building up and having the confidence to be able to do some of these things. But it also sounds like at least with Habitat, inherent in the idea, you also needed to have a level of business acumen. Is that something that you learned like through your path of Habitat, or do you feel like that was something that you'd picked up somewhere else and brought into and sort of enabled you to Habitat?
No, I really appreciate that. And that is, thanks for picking up on that. I would say one of the people that I look back as a designer, I worked for a company called Socialcast. That's actually what brought us to San Francisco in 2009. And my CEO at the time, Tim Young, super, super smart guy, like on multiple dimensions. Like he really trusted me a lot with the product. And he's a great product thinker and had a lot of opinions. And we like had this really great relationship. And he would talk a lot about what the business was trying to do and what the economics of the thing were and how we were going about selling to enterprise. And I would sometimes get to do ride-alongs on sales calls, and listening to how he thought about these pieces sharpened stuff that like in previous startups I'd been aware of and like, but I didn't have to think about. I felt like I started thinking about the business at that point. Like I really started understanding that like design is one piece of how we express this thing in the world. And for it to work, there are so many things that need to be considered. And as a designer, it's like, if you're not considering the business model, pricing and packaging and how features are accessed or not accessed based on tiers and plans and whatnot, like you can paint yourself into corners that are hard to get out of. So I look back on that as one. I feel like I was exposed to some interesting folks at Twitter that definitely had like very high business IQ, also some that didn't. But I felt like that muscle kept getting developed. And Habitat was really like me throwing myself in and saying like, okay, like you've got to be able to level up these skills as well if you really want to be able to, build something and really do something of your own.
For a designer who's like at the beginning of their career and they're like first job, second job, a lot of designers, there's still like lots of skills and tools that they want to learn. How would you advise them that they should like balance or sequence the craft of design and maybe like developing their business IQ?
So there's a level of like business acumen that I think is just valuable. And that's probably as simple as like, do you understand your company's business model? If you don't, it's probably a good thing to spend some time understanding, because like at least you'll know whether or not you're at a company that has any chance in hell of like actually succeeding. Business models are a thing. Design your business model. Like that's another piece to it, is like design can be expressed in lots of ways. Business model is one of them. I would say that especially folks who, here's a great example. If you're in a company that's got a, product-led growth, so PLG kind of model, you probably need to like ramp that up a lot, because the product itself is doing all of the marketing and selling and like a lot of the activation. And so it really is a serious challenge for designers to understand what the business is, what the needs of the customer are, what they're going to pay for, what certain things are going to be incentives for them to actually like make that commitment. I think if you're young and at the beginning of your career and you're in a larger organization, you have the opportunity to like study whole business units. And there's a lot of smart folks who are responsible for those things. A lot of times the product manager that you're working with is probably on the hook for something related to a revenue number. So becoming friends with them and understanding what are your motivations? Like what are the things that you are trying to optimize for that you care about? As a designer, I may or may not also care about those, but I think it's incredibly valuable, and it can shed light on the different aspects that go into understanding how you take a product that you've built and turned it into a business. Now, if you spend all your time doing that and not sharpening your skills and honing your craft, you might not have a job in a little while. So it's, this is probably in the like 80-20, 90-10-ish range, but it's, I would say like be business curious, right? Like if you can be curious about, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I'm going to start over in a second, but there's a fly in here that's like driving me insane. I'm so sorry. Let me do that again. So it's probably like an 80-20 thing, maybe 90-10, right? Like maybe 90-10. I don't know. Being business curious, just even being good, like asking questions around how do people pay for this? Like studying the pricing and packaging and trying to understand the decisions that went into making that the thing that we put into the world. I think it's really valuable. There is so much great content on YouTube. There's a lot of, and other places, but like there's a lot of content where you can kind of ramp your business acumen up pretty fast. It's really, to me though, where can you apply it? So like, what conversations can you be a part of where you can pull on a thread and you can start asking questions, or you can say, hey, I've never seen this kind of a business model before. I've always done SaaS, but this is a consumer product. Like, talk to me about the margins, things like that. And, I think if there's space for it, people get very excited in some cases, to share that type of stuff. And I think some designers that I've known over my career that had that kind of curiosity, that opened doors. It really opened doors. And in some cases, I saw folks move into product roles. In some cases, I saw folks leave and found companies. In other cases, they just became responsible for bigger and bigger chunks of things because they could think at a kind of like another level. And that made them really, really valuable.
Very cool. I'm going to switch gears here a little bit. Every career has challenges. We all have them. Can you talk to me about a difficult time in your career and how you navigated it?
Well, I gave you the post-Twitter in-between habitat one already. So I guess maybe being really like and vulnerable, Abstract was sold. I had some real health issues in 2021. They carried on, actually still working my way out of them, but I had health issues going on. I was, done. Like we're a little bit out of COVID at that point. So I'm, all the things. I just wasn't in a great headspace, if I'm totally honest. And I really sat at this moment of like, who am I? What am I going to do? What mattered? Like I like really genuinely existential level, like, shit. Do I want to go back to being a designer? Do I want to start another company? Do I want to leave all of this and go live in the woods and not talk to people anymore? Some days the answer to that was closer to yes. And it was really a challenging moment to really sit with why I was in that spot. And one of the big pieces was like, my identity had been so enmeshed with what I did for a very long time before Twitter, but then Twitter definitely like really amplified that. Then leaving and Habitat and Abstract and like being part of the venture community and being part of startups and talking to people around the world. And like, suddenly here's this persona, here's this version of Josh, this character that I was playing. And I was like, I don't know if I want to play this character anymore. And I have a wife and 2 kids and like, got to earn a living and would like to be a, productive, contributing member of society. And then when I got down to it, I was like, okay, I have done a lot of different things. And in each instance, I had to take a leap every time it was like, this is past my comfort zone. This is beyond what I safely know. And it forced me into that growth zone, right? Like, if there's your safety zone, you go out about another 100 another 20% beyond that, you're in the zone of growth. It's like, ooh, I'm being stretched. You go past that and that's like, you risk everything exploding. And so sitting down and being like, okay, what can I do that allows me to like take everything that I've learned and also like channel it into something that feels like me now. Kind of fuzzy language, but that's the best I could do, because that really was where I was at. It was like, this version of me right in this moment, what can I do? And I was really fortunate. Allie Mitchell, who was one of the partners at EQT Ventures, reached out and was like, hey, like, we've got this operator network of folks. I'd love to connect you with some of our founders. And I was like, cool. I mean, I've been advising and mentoring folks for a long, long time. And the idea of being able to go in and help some founders, that were kind of early stage, I was like, yeah. And then he was like, I'm hiring. And so I had this amazing opportunity to go into venture and do the job at EQT Ventures. And I'm so grateful to them. I learned a ton. I got to sit on the other side of the table. I understood a lot more of the structure of venture and how it operates on the other side of things. Gave me a lot more appreciation for folks that I did know. It also left me with a like, oh, this is wild. Like, it's a lot of money just like moving around. When you think about the scale of venture capital and what it does, it's pretty wild. And so I did that for about a year and realized that wasn't even it, right? And so I could have at that moment been like, you blew it, and instead it was this moment of like, okay, the whole point was to figure out if this was the thing. Not exactly right, not totally wrong. Like, there's pieces of it that I still do and I still enjoy doing, but that exact thing, it wasn't the thing. And so getting really comfortable with, let me rephrase that, unlearning and like rewiring this thing that felt like it needed to form, needed to live up to something that you'd put out, like reprogramming that into like, no, you just need to find a way to be as much of you as you can possibly be right now. That was a lot of work, if I'm honest. And it led me to where I am right now, which is like, I'm so grateful that I had some connections that like this door opened and I have the opportunity to work with founders, CEOs, and help them in that transition from like, there's a real transition from being a founder to being a CEO. And that transition is a thing that I wish I would have had this kind of support early on, and to be able to do that for folks now is like, it's pretty powerful. So it's, here's where we landed, but man, that moment after everything, it felt like, it was a lot.
Do you want to share a little bit about where you've landed now?
Sure. So I am really fortunate working with a great group of folks at a company called Enjoy the Work, which even the name was pretty fantastic, because I don't think I always enjoyed the work running a high growth venture backed startup. And the idea that you could possibly enjoy the work was like, yes. Okay. And there's this beautiful thing. We focus on like 3 core things, right? There's general management, functional management, and self-management. And so the self-management is a lot of the interpersonal stuff, how we show up, how we communicate, inner work, right? Making sure that you show up in a way that is both authentic to yourself, but really is setting an example for the folks you're working with, clear, kind communication. Then the functional management is like all the different functions in your business: sales, marketing, product design, engineering, HR, all those pieces, and understanding how to actually run and manage those functions. And then all the parts that go into running the business, right? And so we really are this interesting Venn diagram. And for me, it's always been something like just the traditional kind of like coaching stuff. So the interpersonal stuff is fantastic. And I mean, shout out to Stuart McCullough, who is my coach at Abstract. And like, I love this man. He is, to this day, one of my favorite humans that I've gotten to know in this whole journey. And that's like one piece of it. And then I still enjoy the tactical side of things. And I finally found a role that allowed me to find that overlap between those two expressions. And so work with, seed. I'd say we're split, but the other piece of it is we work across many stages. So we have companies at seed, A, B, C, D, E, like all the way up. Really cool twist on the whole thing though is the partnership part of it is like, I feel like I have the Avengers backing me up because each of the partners brings a unique skill set. And so if I've got a sales question that I can't answer, I know who to call. If I've got a go-to-market, or if I've got a legal question, or if I've got a finance, and we all support one another and one another's companies. So it's a really, really great group of humans. And I'm excited because, if this next generation of founders could, I don't call it even 10% more enjoy what they're doing and be 10% better at what they're doing, we could see a different ecosystem and a different landscape happen. And that's appealing to me.
There's the function specific aspect that seems clear, like for you to come in and help a founder understand how to run a design org makes a lot of sense. But there's a lot of what you described that you'll be doing that is maybe more function agnostic. And I think those are also areas where it's unusual to find someone with a design background, like maybe more people who have a business background or finance or like something like that. As a designer, what do you like? What unique advantages or perspectives do you think you bring into a role like that, being such a sort of unusual fit for that type of thing?
Yeah. I really appreciate that. So I asked myself that question. And one of the pieces was reflecting back, and like I would say that like there were times where I feel like I did this really well and times where I didn't do it super well. So I'm just owning that. But like, especially as a founder and especially as the CEO, arguably you're designing all the things. You're designing the hiring process. You're designing the compensation package. You're designing the equity comp. You're designing, like, we don't call it designing, but you are, right? You're making conscious decisions. You're taking in as much information. You're trying to understand who's going to be affected by how this thing works, how you create the culture in your company. If you're intentional about it, that can make or break your business, right? And so I feel like it's less about bringing like pixel level skill into the equation, although occasionally it's super fun to be able to sit down and like helping founders with their pitch deck and being like, hey, here's like 4 things you could do that will immediately make this 10 times better. And they're always thankful for that. But I just think of that as like one tool in the tool belt. I think it's really more about empathy. It's about understanding how to create an environment where you can have the best possible conversation to try to get at the outcome that you're looking for. And then I think the last piece, and I don't know, sometimes I think this is too fuzzy, but like, I just think about stuff in a way that's a little bit different. And so like, we talk about diversity of thought and diversity of opinion and diversity, right? Like being really valuable. And I believe that one of the things I bring to the table is like, I just have a different lens on some of these things. And so being able to apply, a couple of decades of design and startup experience into any conversation, I think is really valuable. And folks really, really appreciate it when you can bring a design perspective to something like, I don't know, hiring. Or, places where they wouldn't think that would necessarily be the thing. Or classic, designer trope is, getting, it's out on the whiteboard and everything, right? But like, there's just like tools that we have as designers that are valuable in lots of contexts. And if you can show someone how to use them, turns out they probably can take it and then show others. And that's one of the coolest things is seeing folks take something small that you're like, you're not even conscious of the value. Really, it's just there. And they're like, what? You just blew my mind by doing this. What do you mean we could sort these things this way? And you're like, yeah, this is a thing. This is a whole thing, and suddenly they latch onto it and it becomes a skill for them. So that's what I'm hoping. And I believe I'm not hoping. That's what I believe I'm bringing to the table and what makes me unique in the partnership, but also in this environment. I mean, you're not wrong. There are not a lot of designer founders to begin with. There's a lot less designer CEOs. And so trying to keep being out there, making the connections. And at the end of the day, it's in being in service to folks is really, honestly, ultimately what it ends up being about.
Man, that's so awesome. And looking back, we've gone from you starting off as a teacher, finding design, building up your skills, working at Twitter and being able to work on some amazing, very large scale products, and then becoming a startup founder. And now you're helping startup founders. And it's so interesting to see how probably unpredictable that path been. I imagine you never would have guessed that that was a path from the very beginning.
Definitely.
For someone who's sort of like at the beginning of that and, has who knows what winds and turns in front of them, what advice would you give them?
So a handful of things hit my brain right away. The first one, which is interesting, is don't try to make everybody happy. It just, A, it's not your job to make other people happy. And B, you can lose a lot of time and a lot of energy in that motion. If you can do the work early on, look yourself in the eyes and like really be honest with yourself. What do I care about? What don't I care about? What are the things that like I'm not willing to negotiate on? And what things am I like actually pretty open and like I'm flexible and kind of willing to, let things flex. I think those are incredibly valuable. We live in a weird world where social media and the hyper-connected reality that we all live in and experience drives, I think, everyone to feel like they need to be this thing or produce this thing and there's some part of that that's true, right? Like business is business and like awareness and brand and all those things. And I can say from my experience, it's like lean into being you. The thing, like if you could figure out the thing that makes you, like really because there's really probably a handful of things about each one of us that are like really the unique bit. If you could find that, go all in. Don't apologize for it. Don't try to hide it. Like that would be huge. Get smart about managing your money. That'd be another huge one. Become savvy, become financially literate. Don't say, "Oh, I'm a designer. I can't learn those things." It's just not true. And the faster you can begin to have just basic understanding, it gives you a better leverage to negotiate and understand because your time is money, right? Like that's ultimately we're trading. And so I wish I could go back and sober myself up and be like, look, you are an intelligent young man who is capable of learning. Go figure this chunk out. And I've been very fortunate. Like we are okay. And I talk to a lot of younger folks, and they're like this is a thing, and like the economy we live in, there's a reason why people are worried about that. And so, to me, it's like educate yourself. Understand that you exist in a capitalist system. Like, the faster you can get to grips with that, you can either decide that you don't like it and you can figure out a way to not do that, or you can understand like, oh, it's a system. It's a system. Systems have rules. They work very predictably if you know what they are. They look weird and erratic if you don't. And so that'd be another one. And then, okay, to designers, actually this probably applies to anybody, but I'll like zero in on designers. Make a lot of stuff. And honestly, it doesn't even matter if you share it with the world. It doesn't. But like when you are young, make as much as you can. Find something that you're curious about. Go after it. Find a problem. Design a solution to it. You may never build it, but then you might get curious enough and be like, this design's good. Maybe I should try prototyping it in Swift. I don't know. Maybe I should use something that allows me to create a working prototype. Never know. You might teach yourself how to code. You might start using AI and you might start understanding like, oh shit, I can build way more than I thought I could. And so really challenge your own limitations and just make things. There's a great quote. I think it's James Murphy. I think who said the best way to complain is to make something. And I have thought about that a lot over the years. A lot of people can moan and complain about different stuff, but it's like, if you really, the best way to complain is to make a thing and be like, here's what I think the answer is, or here's an opposing view, or here's a different way to look at this. And again, whether you ever share it with the world or not, it's something that you did, and you're learning about yourself ultimately at the end of the day. So, anyways, rambling on, but those are the things that popped as soon as you asked that question. So thank you.
Wow. Thank you for sharing your journey. And that was awesome. I really appreciate it. Where can our listeners find you online?
On Twitter, I refuse to call it X. So on Twitter, J Brewer. Actually, I'm J Brewer just about everywhere on the internet. Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn. LinkedIn's Joshua Brewer. My website, jbrewer.me. Although that thing hasn't been updated in, 15 years. It's bad at this point. It's embarrassing. Maybe I should do that soon. But yeah, and really appreciate you so much for having me on and asking such thoughtful questions.
Thank you. Well, thanks again for joining, Josh.
All right. Take it easy, man.
That's a wrap for this episode of The Pixelated Path. I want to extend a huge thank you to Josh Brewer for joining us today and sharing his incredible journey. We explored the defining moments of his career, the power of collaboration between design and engineering, and the challenges he faced along the way. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an update. And stay tuned for our next episode, where we'll do a deep dive into the winding, unpredictable career path of another amazing guest. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.